So what I thought we will actually do is open up the floor to you to ask questions, because this was also inspiring. I do have a couple of questions and I want to perhaps segue with that. The first question relates to your inspiration for making cinema. Where do you draw that inspiration from?
For this film specifically, or for?
For this film and more broadly.
Okay. For this film, I was inspired by, primarily because my grandmother was living with dementia, and originally the script was purely just a dementia film. But as I was developing it, my grandmother passed away, and I wanted to expand the theme to something that's beyond just about dementia and its condition and all that. So I expanded it, and thinking about the idea of personal memory and social memory, and how I draw parallels between them in the story. Incidentally, the social and political elements of the film were inspired by the fact that I saw Invisible City by Tan Bin Bin, which is the next film in the festival. In one segment in the film, an elderly gentleman by the name of Han San-yuan was walking around Chongqing High School, Maine, around the lake of the school, and talking about what happened during the student protests in the 50s. And that was really intriguing to me, because I happen to be from that school. But throughout my 4 years in that school, I was never told the alternative version of the stories that happened. We were told through national education and history classes the accounts from outside the fence, but even as students of the school, we were not told the narrative within the fence. So I started to be curious. I started to start researching, and I found these pictures of these students who were 15, 16 at the time. Yet they were so passionate about whatever the issue of the day was. And I started to question, why is there such a huge difference? Why is it so unthinkable for someone like me, who was brought up in the 80s, to have that same kind of passion and fervor for the kinds of causes that we might have felt for. So the film was a result of that, was a reflection of that. That was a very long answer to. Well, and to films in general, perhaps just a bit of background why I'm into filmmaking. I fell in love with filmmaking since I was 15, and when time came for me to do my O-levels, I told my parents that I don't want to go to JC. I really just want to go to an art school. I didn't know that there was a film school at that time in Singapore. And when I found out there was a film school, I was just so thrilled, and that was all I wanted to do. And it helped that at that time my results weren't that great in school, so they were like, okay, you can go ahead. And the moment they gave me that green light, I started to excel in school. I started to have motivation, and then I did well for my O's, and then eventually, I insisted on going into the poly, and that's when I went to film school. And over the years, at that time, for me, inspiration came purely from the idea of make-believe. In cinema, everything that you see in the story exists just within the frame. Everything that's beyond the frame is all artificial. So I was very inspired by the idea of being able to recreate a world, or create a world if I wanted to, and tell the story that way. So yeah.
in the context of Singapore, what role do you think films have to play with respect to social change?
I think the power of film and the power of cinema, apart from informing with facts, is that it is able to inspire empathy. And I think that is something that is very lacking in well, perhaps many societies, but I think in Singapore in particular, when very often we live in a we can be rather comfortable in our little bubbles, and perhaps with that kind of contentment we don't wish to be challenged, and therefore we are informed purely by our opinions and nothing else. So I think films, because they come in the form of storytelling and because they come with themes that are so universal, they have that power to allow someone to see an issue from a different perspective, because the story humanizes the issue, and I think that is the power of film as a medium.
When youth watch this film, is there something you want to tell them, or you want them to see, or is there a message you would like to bring across to them?
Well, not everyone in that era was necessarily active. In fact, I mean, the reason for a lot of the Chinese educated at that time to be silenced is, well, partly is propaganda, but at the same time it was because people wanted peace. You know, people didn't want to have to deal with all these issues, but as a result of that, and as a result of the clampdown, like Operation Cold Store in '63, it left a trauma in the hearts and minds of many people, and I think till today we are still living the effects of that trauma. It's about questions, you know. It's just I just have questions, and I think that is the way I tend to like to make my films or tell my stories, because I don't want to assume to prescribe ideologies. You know, I'd rather see the question and allow people to think about it. And if I manage to achieve that, I'm happy. Yeah.
The movie touched me on multiple levels. You know, one, like you said, it's just exploring different questions. And something I really liked was, towards the end, there's no moral of the story, right? There's no key message that you take away. It's, like you said, it's just exploring questions and leaving it there for you to take whatever perspective you want to take and start exploring questions in your own way. And also the way it's been taken, you know, without all the background music, because when I think of my childhood days and watching movies, art movies is, I mean, what we would call the ones without all the background noise, used to be pretty dragging, but definitely not this, right? Because it's been taken so elegantly and so aesthetically that it definitely strikes a chord with the audience. I didn't know you were the director sitting here, or I would have said wonderful, great job.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, to what extent is it possible to do a movie like this and still say that there's no actual ideology? I'm wondering whether consciously or unconsciously, I did sense that there was an ideology of sorts. That there were questions being asked, but the very asking of the questions, in a sense. Because the Alzheimer's was an interesting theme, because it was sort of in all the midst of this whole national conversation thing and all, and so much made about museums and archives, The Alzheimer's was interesting because it was symbolic of the kind of necessary forgetting that also goes in to pinning down a national narrative. So I felt as though, I mean, this could be just me taking out something from it, but I felt as though on the one hand there was an ideology not so much of cynicism, but of maybe of wistfulness a little bit, you know. The second thing I wanted to ask you about was the frame, you know, the frame of reference was very Chinese, you know, the funeral, the whole setup, you know, but at the same time, I mean, as an Indian Singaporean, I often feel invisible in the kinds of discourses that go on relating to, you know. But at the same time, what I couldn't help noticing was how much I could still identify with a lot of the things that went on. So for example, the Chinese funeral. I mean, I've been to my friends' parents' funerals, I've seen them in the void decks. So I think that in some sense, this is a very, very Singaporean film still. You know, and that's my way of telling you that I appreciate it. But to go back, the question that I wanted to ask was about the ideology, whether it's possible as a filmmaker to do a film like this and not actually have an ideology.
Well, when I answered that question, I didn't mean I don't have an ideology, or I don't subscribe to any. I'm simply saying in a film like that, I didn't want to prescribe it, you know, because I grew up, as most of you did, with propaganda, and I don't like to be told how to feel and what to think, you know, and yeah, so something with a very overt moral of the story turns me off, you know. So similarly, so when I make a film, I don't wish to do that. But of course, you know, the film questions the kinds of doctrines with which we all live, whether it's the political doctrine or a religious doctrine. What are some of these things that we live with, and should we not be questioning them once in a while, perhaps?
Normally the things that we kept reciting as doctrines in some way, in your film, it's the foreigner from China who is reciting it, you know, as she tries to learn the language. And I found that quite interesting because turning it around, here you in the new generation, here you have the Singaporean who's doing the questioning and the foreigner who's learning the, you know, the propaganda. I found that very interesting.
I actually have two questions. Like, first one, who are your key influences in terms of filmmakers? And also the second one is, I really like the story of the Kingdom of the Sea in the utopia. And so in that, from going from that perspective, what would Sandcastle represent to you, the title of the film?
So I left off that story about my filmmaking starting when I was 15. At the time it was purely Hollywood, because those were all the films that I was exposed to. But along the way, as I went to film school and as I exposed myself to cinemas from around the world, I started to appreciate the different kinds of cinematic movements around the world. And one particular one was the Taiwanese New Wave, and filmmakers like Ho Xiaoxian and Edward Young, who are Taiwanese masters. Oh, by the way, Amelie just won an Oscar for Best Director. So, and yeah, I mean, and I also really like the films of Lee Chang-dong from Korea. He makes these accessible yet art house stories that tackle rather difficult issues, but in a manner that allows you to really just sit and think. The second question was about Sandcastle.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it was it's an allegory for memories. It's an allegory for Singapore. How transient how mutable memories can be, and perhaps how transient Singapore can be.
There was this scene in your show where the mom was like, because in the food court there are these Chinese people who prepare the food, and then the actor goes, we also were, we were Chinese, So I was just curious to know what you feel about like our Chinese roots or whatever roots that we came from as Singaporean. To what extent do you think that's important as compared to the external influences that we have in modern day?
This film was made in 2010, and only lately I'm asked these questions. That comment wasn't picked up as much 3 years ago. Well, I think in the context of the story, it is in some ways En's way of reconciling with how deeply rooted his father's identity was with his Chineseness. It was an era where it wasn't so much they weren't necessarily communists, but they were certainly nationalists, Malayan nationalists, and they imported a certain sense of identity from China, and how that is perhaps now, the kinds of languages. We speak English. People of my generation speak English to one another, but that was a different time, and it's how he reconciles with that idea of identity. Personally, I've always seen myself as Singaporean, more than I see myself as Chinese, even though that's the language I speak at home. And coming from a Chinese school, we were probably taught a disproportionate amount of Chinese and Chinese culture, and we were kind of being indoctrinated a certain way, but still, ultimately, I see myself as Singaporean, so I don't that need to reconnect with the Chinese roots isn't so relevant to me. Today.
There are always three significant generations: the youth like us today, the parents, and the grandparents. So, how as a producer, how were there any difficulties when you're trying to bridge all three generations and trying to create appeal or relevance for each generation as they watch this movie?
Well, when I made Sandcastles, I didn't think who it was going to appeal to. To be honest, I had no idea. And I thought it was going to appeal more to an older generation who might appreciate the fact that some of these themes are being revisited after such a long time. But as it turned out, I seem to be receiving comments more from younger people. So I don't know how it resonates or how it resonates differently. In Sandcastles specifically, I think in terms of language, it didn't occur to me as I was writing it, but then when I was just writing it in how it would sound most naturally. But then as I watched it and as I was filming it, and you realize how much language kind of demarcates the generations. En speaks to his mom in Chinese, in Mandarin. En speaks to his friends in English, but then his parents and his grandparents speak in Hokkien. You know? So, I mean, it's quite interesting, but it also speaks about how you know our heritage in terms of language is really disappearing, and I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this, but then in films, dialects, even in cinemas, are strictly restricted. They go by percentage of the amount of dialect you can speak in a film, and they time it. And then of course on free-to-air TV and on trailers, dialects are strictly not allowed. I think most of us probably see the dialects, the Chinese dialects that we speak as almost like foreign languages, and a lot of people are trying to reclaim these lost languages, but the government policies, when it comes to censorship, clearly is not reflecting that. Yeah.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you because this was a very wonderful film, and above everything else that was said, it really touched me, the way that you characterized the family, the way that you brought the family to life in 3 different generations. What I wanted to ask was, I think maybe related to the earlier question, you mentioned that the movie was made in 2010, but it's set much earlier in 1998, right? Why is that so? Were you hoping to speak to a particular age group?
The only reason why it had to be set not in 2010 is because it's only biological possible for En to have a father who was a student activist. Yeah, I made a timeline and okay. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think a lot of the issues are relevant, so it doesn't matter when it was set necessarily.
Actually, I have a questions because I can tell that you choose the voiceover of the father is a kind of very traditional mainland Chinese Mandarin. It's from China. It's kind of like not any Singaporean will say that kind of Mandarin. Is it you do it on purpose to show that he's a communist?
No, well, my mom was Chinese educated, so are many of her friends, and they do speak very properly, especially if they were writing a letter, and I think it is only authentic to the way that generation, the Chinese educated, had an affinity to language. There was a lot of Chineseness in their culture. So yeah, it's got nothing to do with. Of course, I mean it relates to how his father identified himself. But like Ben said, you know, he probably wasn't communist.
Yeah.
So yeah.
The mother is in a way has been the driving force of the activism during the riots. So maybe my question would be, does the film work as an art piece more than as a piece of documentation to attempt to awaken or retrieve these lost or hidden sentiments? Because I mean, we don't know that the mother has been such a force. She's been the one who's saying that the father has been brainwashed, whereas at the end of the movie we realize that she has been there along with him. So I mean, yeah, does it try to make, you know, remind us of these things? Because I think someone mentioned about forgetting. So maybe is there this kind of like remembering going on?
Well, I think certainly. I think I mean actually I really encourage you guys to all watch Invisible City, which is the next film, tomorrow or the day after. Day after. Because that film is about recording personal represents this. It's a city that we don't see. You know, it's a consciousness that we don't see. You know, and I think that film certainly served as an inspiration to me, and it certainly moved me. But at the same time, I'm a fiction filmmaker, you know, and I want to be able to move people like inside, and also I want to be able to reach a wide enough audience, and hence, you know, fiction filmmaking is something that I've always tried to understand and hone the craft. I think, you know, with Mother in this film, she is that character that perhaps many of us would have heard of, like a distant aunt who disappeared for a few years for no reason and never spoke about her or never spoke about what happened. You know, and after the film was made, I started having so many people tell me, oh, you know, I also had this uncle or I also had this aunt. And, you know, and these are all characters that history has vilified. And somehow, because of how prosperous Singapore has become, they seem to have been really the bad guys, you know, the ones who could have led us astray as a society, you know. But we sometimes fail to remember what exactly was it that some of these people were fighting for. The 50th anniversary of Operation Cold Storm, yeah, 50, and at Hong Lim Park, there was a gathering of all these former detainees, and they're all really old now, and apparently they always had an annual gathering at the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, but this year, for some reason, they decided to do it at Hong Lim Park, and for the first time, Vivian was documenting it, and she was telling me that for the first time, they actually were willing to be so out in the open, willing to be photographed, even willing to be interviewed. You know, does it have to do with, recent political developments, perhaps? But I think also, as a lot of that generation of people are dying, I think many of them want to leave something behind. And a lot of these narratives are starting to surface. In fact, when I was making Sandcastles, there were already a few books that were published. There was the Fajar generation. It was published, I think, a few years ago. And of course, then there was Men in White, which is sort of the other version. But then still, a lot of these contesting narratives are surfacing. And I think it's interesting. It's an interesting time. Especially it seems that the current ruling party is also having issues with the population, and so everything's kind of culminating in an interesting place.
Bringing up the past and then educating the rest about it, like Singaporeans like us who we are not very sure about what happened in the past last time, or we are given a coloured version of what was the original history.
No, I think a lot of the questions that Eun has in the film are questions that I have, and I think they are questions that perhaps many Singaporeans are starting to have. It may not necessarily have to do with the past, but simply the fact that we do not accept things lying down. You know, we don't just accept things anymore. We are starting to question things. I mean, of course, you know, a lot of the discourses that are happening right now may be a little bit immature, in my opinion. But I think perhaps it is a rite of passage for people to first be willing and perhaps be unafraid of asking questions. And in time, perhaps a meaningful discourse will surface, and cinema certainly plays a part. Actually, Singapore theatre has been doing it for a long time. You know, I encourage you guys to also go and watch plays in the theatres, because I think, first of all, there are sort of less restrictions in the theatres and on the stage. So a lot of the theatre makers are able to tackle issues that are very pertinent, and they've been doing it for a long time. But cinema is only starting to do that. So maybe we need to wait a few more years.
Thank you.
I was just curious to know what the process is like for an independent filmmaker here in Singapore, and what, are there any barriers that you faced or things you had to cut, or, what that experience was like for you?
This film was 80% funded by the government. And I have a friendly working relationship with the MDA. They are essentially Singapore's only film funding body when it comes to public funds. But they also happen to be the censorship body. I mean, I've had an issue with that for a long time, the inherent conflicts of interest that comes with such a pairing. But we also, over time, we learn to maneuver and navigate through this strange, sometimes schizophrenic organization. A film that we actually thought we would show here, called Tanjong Ru, which was my short film, which I made when I went back to film school in LaSalle to do my degree. It is about the entrapment of 12 gay men at a gay cruising area at Ford Road back in 1993. That film, up until that time, I had, the Singapore Film Commission had funded all my short films, most of my short films. But this was the one film that I applied, and they said, we seek your understanding that we are unable to fund you. No reasons were given, but I was expected to understand why. None of my films have necessarily been cut, but these restrictions and pressures make a difference to the kinds of themes and subject matters that filmmakers choose to tackle. But it's something that we constantly engage with the MDA to discuss and talk about, why, and why do you, and all that. So, but I also have, on the theme of LGBT issues, I'm also involved with Pink Dot, and I direct all that video clips since 2009, and we put it online, and so it circumvents all of their guidelines, and let's hope it remains that way. Yeah, because with something like Pink Dot, for example, and this is perhaps more directly related to this idea of films for social change, because there is a very direct advocacy same time, all the clips that were done for Pink Dot are still anchored on the idea of empathy and love. It's these universal themes that matter and that are able to speak across the border and bridge any kinds of differences in opinions. Yeah.